Today is June 9th, 2024. Conflict in Ukraine continues to move ever closer to greater escalation. And not escalation between Ukraine and Russia, of course, but escalation between Ukraine's Western sponsors and Russia itself. Why is there escalation? Because panic and desperation are setting in across Western capitals as the fighting on the ground in Ukraine continues to shift increasingly more decisively in Russia's favor. And I will get into all of that here in just a moment, and some of the rhetoric the West is trying to use to at least rhetorically and politically regain momentum. But before we do that, let's take a look at the live map. Now, this is the live map as of June 8th, 2024. And I want to zoom in and take a look. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian map, so please keep that in mind. It's very important to keep that in mind as we look at the information that it is providing. So we see red is Russian-held territory. The red rifle icons you see all along the line of contact from Zaporozhye all the way up to Kharkov. That means Russian forces are on the move. They are on the offensive and they are moving forward. And you will often see the rifle icons outside of what is more or less permanently held Russian territory. For example, here, this was the now significantly reduced salient Ukraine created during its 2023 offensive. You see these red rifle icons. That means there are Russian forces in this area fighting. They have not consolidated control over this territory, but this is what a pro-Ukrainian map is admitting. We see these explosion icons. These are most likely Ukrainian ATACMS, HIMARS, or drone attacks. A lot of times details are very minimal, sometimes to the point where you're not even sure if that is a legitimate strike. I will show you a legitimate strike here in just a moment, or at least a confirmed strike is a better term for it. We see this is a blue flag, but when you hover over it, it indicates that Russia is claiming that it has taken this territory here, so we can expect the map to change accordingly. The Russian Ministry of Defense, just as a side note, does not claim that it has taken territory, even when it obviously has, until well after the fact, until it has been absolutely 100% consolidated. So it's almost a certainty that the map will reflect that, but probably in a few days or even a week or two's time, because this is, again, it's a pro-Ukrainian map. They want to delay that type of information for as long as possible. You see another flag here. Again, this is a Russian gain being reported. And again, you see the red rifle icons. This is all west of Donetsk and Avdiivka. This front line continues to move westward. Of course, around Seversk and Kupiansk. And then let's take a look at what is going on around Kharkov, this new front that Russia has opened and is placing significant pressure on Ukrainian forces, forcing them to commit what reserves they have left to this area. And because Ukraine has lost territory, they feel politically compelled, not tactically or strategically compelled, to try to take it back. So we should expect a significant offensive operation from Ukraine. Whether it succeeds or not, that's another story. So we can see that the fighting continues here. Russian forces continue to use glide bombs. We have to remember, Ukraine itself admits Russia is using up to 3,000 glide bombs a month. That is up to 100 glide bombs a day all along the line of contact. In my previous update, I was showing footage of the impact of some of the medium varieties of these glide bombs. They are massive, much greater than the artillery that Russia uses and has a significant advantage in. Now, I want to show one more thing on this map. If you look in Lugansk, as a matter of fact, inside the built-up urban area, this is, again, a pro-Ukrainian map talking about an ATACMS strike. And if you go to their source, they say that this is a military target when it's clearly an apartment building, and they provide no evidence at all whatsoever that this apartment was being used by the Russian military. And what we do know as a fact is that Ukraine regularly shells civilian infrastructure and targets and apartment buildings. They were doing it in Donetsk, have been doing it in Donetsk since 2014. This is something that is indisputable. And so when we see an attack like this in Lugansk by an ATACMS, this is a result. And I'm going to talk more about this particular strike and the ATACMS itself here in just a moment. But if we take one last look at the map, every single day you're going to see icons like this. Deep inside Ukraine, in one or more locations, you will see Russian missile and drone attacks. These happen almost daily. They happen on a large scale, and we know the extent of this, even though according to this pro-Ukrainian map, they're intercepting absolutely everything. Here's the actual result of these frequent drone and missile attacks. This is from the Washington Post, mind you, June 6, 2024. Outages shroud Ukraine as Russian strikes on power plants take their toll. The article says the cutoffs started Monday and have only increased throughout the week, plunging much of Ukraine's capital into darkness, save for a few hours every day. In some parts of the city, even the traffic lights are turned off, and at night, entire neighborhoods are draped in black. The relentless pounding of Ukraine's power plants by Russian drones and missiles is finally being felt. So if Ukraine has been intercepting all of these missiles and drones, how has Russia managed to knock out Ukraine's power grid? It's a very large country, a very well-developed power grid. How has Russia managed to do this? Obviously, these claims of intercepting this many drones, this many missiles fired by Russia is propaganda. I think people should accept that at this point. The state electricity distributor said the latest onslaught on the power grid over the weekend meant rationing power throughout the country. It had been the sixth such barrage since March. So it's happening fairly frequently. And the reason I want to talk about this is not just because it is important to keep track of Russia's targeting of Ukrainian infrastructure, how it is whittling this infrastructure down, and the power grid especially. Alexander Mikuris of the Duran, in a recent video of his, has talked about the economic impact this will have, a long-term economic impact this will most certainly have. But it's also important as a reference point to understand just how many missiles, how many drones you need to be using, and how frequently and on what scale to achieve strategic results in a conflict. We hear all the time about how Ukraine is going to use ATACMS, Scalp, Storm Shadow to strike inside Russia, missiles of its own design, drones. It's going to use it to turn the table on Russia. Does anyone actually believe or think that Ukraine will ever have access to as many drones and missiles that are necessary to even just match what Russia has done to Ukraine? Forgetting the fact that Russia is a much larger country than Ukraine, has much more extensive infrastructure, a much larger and more extensive industrial base spread out over a much greater area. It is the largest country by land mass on Earth, let's not forget. Does anyone think that Ukraine will have even enough missiles and drones that are going to get through to even make a noticeable impact beyond generating headlines, beyond public relations, and trying to bolster the morale of the Ukrainian people and the international audiences still supporting Ukraine? Does anyone think that that's achievable at this point? Using Russia's own missile and drone campaign as a reference point, and then looking at how incomparable Ukraine's efforts have been, help us understand this much more clearly, especially when we hear Western analysts, politicians talking about theories of victory, which include this component of striking deep within Russia. It's important to understand how absolutely unrealistic that is now and always will be. Speaking of Western weapons being transferred over to Ukraine, we have this latest release by the US Department of Defense right here. This is their official website. Biden administration announces additional security assistance for Ukraine, June 7th, 2024. So as I often do, or at least I used to do often, these used to come out once, twice a month. They are much more infrequent now. And the actual packages themselves have diminished in terms of quantity and also quality. So let me go over it point by point. There is a list here, as you can see, of all of the types of weapons and munitions being sent, but absolutely not even a single quantity. And if people remember earlier updates, when I covered these releases, they would often include many quantities for many of the components of the list. Now there's not even one quantity listed, and the reason that is because it's not to hide it from the Russians. The Russians have the intelligence capabilities to determine how much of what the West is sending to Ukraine. They are facing off against it on the battlefield every single day. This is about public relations. You put the quantity in there to give the public the impression that massive amounts of weapons and ammunition are being sent to Ukraine. And you cannot lie about that, because if you claim that you're sending 1 million artillery shells in one single package, and then the result on the battlefield obviously contradicts that claim, then you lose all credibility. So when they were putting together packages that were somewhat sizable, they were more than happy to include the quantity because it helped bolster the image of this torrent of weapons and ammunition being sent to Ukraine. That is no longer the case. They can no longer afford to include a quantity component. So let's go over it piece by piece. The first on the list is missiles for Hawk air defense systems. Now, I've talked about the Hawk air defense system at length when it was first discussed, announced that it would be sent. This was all the way back in 2022, I do believe, when it was first being mentioned and announced that it would be sent. And I mentioned how these air defense systems were the predecessor to the Stinger and the Patriot, and the United States itself hasn't used it for decades. And so essentially it's a museum piece that they are sending to Ukraine. The missiles themselves have to be completely refurbished before they're sent to Ukraine. And I mentioned how if the Stingers and the Patriots were not performing very well for Ukraine, how would the predecessor to those systems perform any better? And of course, we haven't heard anything at all about the Hawk air defense system since it was sent to Ukraine, except this, and I have covered this previously. This announcement, this was April of this year, US to sell $138 million in urgent military upgrades to Ukraine. And that was for the Hawk air defense system because it's useless. And they need to upgrade it, modernize it, and get it to actually work. Because right now it obviously doesn't work. You wouldn't need to do this if it was working well in the first place. And when they talk about upgrades this extensive, it's not something that happens over a weekend. It could take months, it could take a year or more to complete, and it's still questionable whether this system, as old as it is, will ever be able to be used effectively by Ukraine in this type of fighting. Next on the list, speaking of Stingers, are more Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. Stingers are often used in a man-portable system carried by infantry, and they're able to use this at close ranges, around up to 8 kilometers. So they would be able to target and shoot down enemy aircraft engaged in close air support, like the Russian Su-25 or any number of Russian helicopters that might be over the battlefield. However, at this point, Russia has adapted its tactics and strategies, no longer conducting operations that put their aircraft in range of Stingers and other types of man-portable systems. What they're using are systems like glide bombs, which operate even outside the range of medium and some of the longer range air defense systems Ukraine has. And of course, Russian attack helicopters fire guided missiles that have much longer ranges than these man-portable systems. As we had seen in 2023 during Ukraine's offensive, Russian attack helicopters were operating outside of portable air defense systems. They were firing missiles at Ukrainian armor. A lot of it was Western armor transferred over to Ukraine. It was left burning on the battlefield. Next, ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket systems. They don't specify, but this could mean three possible types of munitions. There's the 70-kilometer range GPS-guided rockets that HIMARS fires. There's the 150-kilometer range ground-launched small-diameter bomb. It's a glide bomb attached to a rocket that is fired by HIMARS. And then there's the 300-kilometer range ATACMS. This is a ballistic missile similar to Russia's Iskander missile system. The Russian system is much more numerous and has a longer range of 500 kilometers. 2 out of 3 of these munitions have been rendered ineffective by Russian electronic warfare jamming. This is admitted even by the US government and the Western media. So the guided rockets and the ground-launched small-diameter bombs, those have been rendered ineffective. It doesn't mean that they don't occasionally get through and destroy Russian equipment. It just means more of them fail than hit their target. And it does seem to be the case that ATACMS is suffering similar problems. They are also GPS guided, so there's no reason to believe, for some reason, Russian jamming isn't working on them as well. But because they have a longer range, they have the ability to hit a much larger number of targets, which makes it more difficult for Russia to defend against, especially if you're shooting at apartments. Russia wouldn't normally deploy jamming for civilian apartments, but this would be an easy target for Ukraine to hit and then just claim it was a military target. And that brings us back to that example that I just showed you on the liveuamap.com. Next on the list, 155 millimeter howitzer rounds, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds. The reason they sent 105 millimeter rounds is because there weren't enough 155 millimeter rounds, and nothing has happened between the last time I talked about this and now where suddenly they have more rounds. There's no quantity listed. The reason why is because the 155 millimeter artillery rounds going to Ukraine are being drawn from monthly production. There are no more large stockpiles that they can draw from to send large quantities of shells to Ukraine. Again, the Czech-led initiative is falling apart. 50%, admittedly, 50% of those shells are useless. They have to be refurbished if they are to even be attempted to be sent to Ukraine. Next on the list is 81 millimeter mortar system. This is not a system that is going to make or break the conflict. Again, no quantity is given. M113 armored personnel carriers. These are armored personnel carriers. They're useful against small arms and also shrapnel up to a certain extent. An artillery shell hits it, it's destroyed. Large caliber weapons hit it. Even large caliber infantry weapons hit it, it will destroy it. It'll punch holes through it and kill the people inside. Drones, anti-tank guided missiles, obviously mines, and any type of gun mounted on Russian armored vehicles, armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. These will all destroy M113s. Now the M113 is used to bring troops to the front and bring casualties away from the front. But if the troops themselves are not properly trained, properly armed, properly supported with air power and artillery, then it doesn't matter what you're using to bring them back and forth to the line of contact. Trailers to transport heavy equipment. So this is about moving tanks from, say, the border with Poland, where they have to go to get repaired and then brought back to the line of contact. You use a trailer to bring it to the line of contact. You cannot drive these armored vehicles 1,000 kilometers from the border with Poland to the front line. They only operate under their own power when they're on the battlefield. Otherwise, it's using up maintenance hours. By driving it from Poland to the battlefield, it's already going to break down and have to go back to Poland at that point. That is the reality of using armored vehicles on a modern battlefield. And there's no quantity mentioned here, but in previous packages where there were numbers, quantities included, they're in the single digits, or maybe 10, 15 trailers and trucks being sent to Ukraine for this purpose. Not nearly enough for a conflict of this scale. Coastal and riverine patrol boats. Now, Ukraine goes through these very, very quickly, and they do it by conducting these cross-river operations, taking swampy enclaves on the east side of the Dnieper River, around Kherson, for example. These operations are admittedly conducted for public relations purposes. They serve no strategic purpose at all whatsoever, and often by conducting them, they are expending huge amounts of manpower and equipment that could be better used doing almost anything else. And we know this because the Western media has said this, has admitted this. This is from the Washington Post, January 2024, so at the beginning of this year. Ukraine Marines recount deadly mission to free towns east of Dnieper River. Well, they're not really freeing any towns east of the Dnieper River. And deadly mission for who? For the Russians or for the Ukrainians? And so the first paragraph says this: on the morning of his first crossing of the Dnieper River, where his unit was being sent in a desperate effort to claw back occupied land from Russia, the 21-year-old Ukrainian Marine woke up ready to die. So already a pretty bleak beginning to this article. It goes on later in the article to explain, frustrated by reports from Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Ministry, which in November stated that it had managed to consolidate positions on several strongholds on the Dnieper River, the Marines recounted wounded soldiers drowning, unable to swim, with their injuries or sucked to the river bottom by their heavy packs. The crossing was so dangerous that the bodies of some Marines killed in the first wave to cross the river 2 months ago were left behind. Ukraine does not publicly disclose its number of military casualties and has declined to specify how many Marines have been killed in the mission, which seized back just a few square kilometers of land, including a toehold in the fishing village of Krynki. A spokesman for the Ukrainian Marine Corps declined to comment. "We are still in silence on this matter," he said, but the military acknowledges there have been few gains. There are no liberated villages on the East Bank, which is what I said, which is what the Washington Post was trying to imply, but then contradicts in the body of the article. There are no liberated villages. This was the head of the Joint Press Center of Ukraine's Southern Defense Force. That is who said that. So the U.S. is sending more boats to continue this utterly pointless cross-river warfare that is achieving nothing except getting Ukrainian soldiers killed and losing equipment that could be used elsewhere. And again, if you just looked at this list, and didn't know any better, and you saw everything from air defense to artillery to armored personnel carriers, there's even patrol boats. I mean, you would think that the West was just flooding Ukraine with absolutely everything. That is the impression you're supposed to get. But when you actually peel back the layers and examine what is actually being sent and what it is being used to do, or what is being attempted on the battlefield with these systems, then you realize just how futile all of this actually is. Next on the list is tube-launched optically tracked wire-guided missiles. TOW missiles, these are, again, 1980s anti-tank weapons. They're still effective. The problem is the US has already sent thousands and thousands of these to terrorists in Syria to fight the Syrian government there. And they've been sending huge numbers of these to Ukraine. It's very unlikely that large quantities are still available to send Ukraine in these packages. Now, these can be operated by infantry teams on the ground, and they're also mounted on vehicles like the Humvee or even the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Next on the list, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems. Again, thousands of these were sent to Ukraine in the initial couple of tranches, and even the Western media admitted that stockpiles were depleted. Production would take years to replace all of the systems that were sent to Ukraine. So again, whatever is being sent are very small quantities of these systems. And we don't hear about the Javelin anymore, do we? And then next is small arms, ammunition, and grenades. This was one of the few items on these types of lists that they would still put quantities to, even as recently as this year. And the reason they did that was because when you send 5.56 millimeter rounds for NATO assault weapons and 7.62 rounds for Soviet era Russian, Ukrainian manufactured, Eastern European manufactured weapons, the quantities would be in the millions, and that would impress the public, because the public doesn't understand that in modern warfare, a single brigade of about 4,000 men can go through millions of rounds in just a week or two of intense combat operations. Next on the list are demolition munitions, night vision devices, spare parts, maintenance, and other equipment. So all these odds and ends, nothing that is game-changing, certainly nothing that Russia doesn't have in greater quantities, especially night vision devices. We remember at the beginning of the special military operation back in 2022, this was one of the items the collective Western media claimed gave Ukraine such a huge advantage. Ukraine has Western night vision devices. Russia has none. They're blind in the dark. This gives a huge advantage to Ukraine, but that was never true, and it most certainly isn't true now. Russian modern main battle tanks always had thermal imaging. They could see day or night, regardless of what the weather was doing, for kilometers and kilometers, and they could identify a target, fire, and hit that target on the first shot. Today, you will see, if you follow Russian units who publish footage of drone warfare, they have not only observation drones with thermal imaging, spotting targets, they have kamikaze drones that you use only one time that also have thermal imaging. So they are able to either produce or procure cheap enough thermal imaging systems that they could afford to put on a kamikaze drone and use just one time. And that footage has been increasing in quantity and quality over just the last couple of months even. So that is something that they are continuously expanding the use of. That is the entire list from the Pentagon. As you can see, it really doesn't add up to much. It looks impressive to the uninformed average member of the public, but again, you peel back the layers, you see that it really does not add up to much. Who else is sending weapons and equipment and training to Ukraine? France is being very aggressive recently in this regard. We have this article from France 24, Macron to supply Ukraine with Mirage 2000 TAC-5 warplanes and train pilots and troops in France. Okay, so the Mirage is the easiest way to explain what the Mirage 2000 TAC-5 is the less successful version of the 1980s US-made F-16. And of course, both airframes have been modernized over time, but it is essentially a French version of the US-made F-16. And so what French President Macron is saying is he's going to send these to Ukraine in addition to the F-16s that are going to Ukraine. The article says, tomorrow we will launch a new cooperation and announce the transfer of Mirage 2000 TAC-5 fighter jets to Ukraine, made by a French manufacturer, Dassault, and train their Ukrainian pilots in France, Macron told French TV. Macron said he would offer Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, when the two met for talks at the Elysee Palace in Paris on Friday, that the pilots be trained from this summer. You need normally between 5 to 6 months. So by the end of the year, there will be pilots. The pilots will be trained in France, he said. It doesn't take 5 to 6 months to train pilots. It could take years to train pilots. Even pilots who already know how to fly aircraft, it could still take a very long time to train them on a new airframe, especially when you're going from Soviet-era equipment over to NATO. There's nothing the French-made Mirage 2000 or the US-made F-16 can do that Ukraine's original Air Force that it began this conflict with couldn't do. So they're sending these aircraft because they're out of Soviet-era aircraft to transfer over to Ukraine. So now they need to start tapping into surplus NATO aircraft. That is what's going on. It is a painful, slow motion repeat of what we just watched unfold over a year or two regarding Western-made battle tanks. Do you remember how they introduced Western-made battle tanks, the German-made Leopard 1 and 2 tanks, the British Challenger 2, and of course the US M1 Abrams? Remember how they were game changers. They were going to sweep Russian forces off the battlefield. And I pointed out, even before the first Western-made battle tanks rolled into Ukraine, that this was never going to work out in Ukraine's favor. It takes years to integrate a new weapon system, even if it's an old weapon system, but it's being transferred to a military that has never used them. It takes years to integrate them into their fighting force and use them effectively on the battlefield. I had pointed out at the time that Iraq was given M1 Abrams. Saudi Arabia uses US-made M1 Abrams. They had multi-year training and development programs to integrate them into their armed forces, and they still struggle to use them on various battlefields in different conflicts since then. And so handing them over to Ukraine with just a few months training was always going to be a disaster. The fact that you're giving Ukraine not one type of NATO main battle tank, but 2 or 3 or more, means you are not only giving them a weapon system that will be difficult to integrate, but you're giving them multiple systems that require multiple training, maintenance, logistics, and sustainment pipelines. You're complicating their logistics. There's a reason why militaries around the globe standardize their military equipment. You have one main battle tank, one type of main battle tank, maybe 2 at most, which will be and the 2 will be very similar to one another, like the Russian T-72, T-90, T-80. They share many common features that reduce the strain on logistics, training, sustainment, maintenance. By sending these vastly different systems to Ukraine, you compound all of these problems. You eliminate the advantages of standardization, and you complicate everything on top of all the disadvantages they're already starting out with. So now we're talking about doing that with aircraft, a more complex weapon system that requires much more time to integrate into a military. Remember, Romania has spent a decade trying to switch from Soviet-era aircraft over to the F-16, and they're still not done doing that. So how is Ukraine doing this over the course of a couple of months or maybe a year or two? It's impossible. It will not work. It will unfold exactly in the same way as transferring Western-made battle tanks to Ukraine did. Here's another problem to think about. We hear the French president making all of these promises regarding the Mirage 2000 warplane that they will be sending to Ukraine. They will have pilots by the end of the year, he says. All of these promises being made about the Mirage 2000. Remember all the promises that were being made about the F-16. And think about how many disappointing setbacks there have been since then. And here's one of the most recent setbacks. It's from Politico. Ukraine frustrated with US over F-16 pilot training. Kiev is increasingly frustrated by the limited training pipeline. The US says it has other customers. And this was June 5th, 2024. This is what the article says. Ukraine says it has 30 pilots who are eligible to start training in the US immediately. Yet the Biden administration has told Kiev it lacks the school seats in its Arizona-based program to accept more than 12 trainees at a time, according to 3 people with direct knowledge of the request. 2 other facilities in Denmark and Romania have a similar issue with available training spots. It also says the US has told the Ukrainian military that in addition to limited space, other countries are in line for F-16 training at the base, and that it cannot break its commitments to those nations. And some people might say, well, why not just expand training? And these are people who have never trained anyone to do anything. When you are training pilots or tank crews or weapon operators, you don't just need a place to do it, a physical facility to do the training, and obviously to house those who are being trained and to take care of all of those type of needs. You need to have the instructors themselves. You have to have the equipment that they will be training on, whether they're simulators, the actual weapons, vehicles, or aircraft that they will be operating. All of that needs to be there in insufficient quantities to train any given number of trainees. It's very difficult to just expand that out, especially the human resource component of that, the actual instructors instructing the trainees. So that's the reason why it can't just be expanded. You can expand it, but it will take a lot of time. Politico says Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium plan to ship more than 60 US-made F-16 jets to Kiev this summer. Ukrainians argue that the ability to fly more F-16s will help Kiev push back Russian forces from the front lines in places such as Kharkov, where Moscow has advanced in recent weeks. Yet the US has said it does not expect the jets to be a game changer on the battlefield, because they won't be. They obviously won't be. And if even the US is saying that, that says something right there. The article also says a total of 20 Ukrainian F-16 pilots are expected to graduate by the end of this year. Half of the 40 needed to operate a full squadron of 20 jets. So you need 2 pilots per jet. According to the former DoD official, 8 new pilots are scheduled to begin training in Romania, and 8 more will soon arrive in Tucson. The former official said the facility in Denmark will not accept any additional pilots. So if 40 pilots are needed for 20 aircraft, but only 20 are being trained in 1 year, it'll take 2 years to train all the pilots necessary to fly just 20 aircraft. How long is it going to take to train pilots to operate 60 or more F-16s? And if this is the problem that Ukraine and NATO has putting Ukrainians in F-16s, how is this not also going to be a problem with French Dassault Mirage 2000 TAC-5 warplanes? By the time Ukraine is able to utilize the 60th F-16 transferred over to them, there will no longer be anywhere near 60 F-16s operating in and over Ukraine's battlefields. What will happen is, just like with the armored vehicles, critical mass will never be reached. And if there is no critical mass reached, then Ukraine is never going to be able to push Russian forces from the front lines in places such as Kharkov. It will never happen, because they will never have enough warplanes operating at any given time to do that. They will be destroyed, the pilots killed, faster than they can build up the critical mass to have a proper air force. It takes years, it could take a decade or more to build a functioning air force, which is what they're trying to do in the middle of a conflict under less than ideal conditions. It is just completely unrealistic. The same France 24 article also says he, as in French President Macron, said France would equip and train an entire brigade of 4,500 Ukrainian soldiers so they can defend themselves when they return to Ukraine from training. So they're going from Ukraine to France to train 4,500 Ukrainians, and then they're going back to Ukraine, trained and equipped by France. Now, I've done entire videos about how unrealistic it is to just build up a brigade over the course of a couple of months or even a year or two. It's extremely unrealistic. And we remember that Ukraine tried to stand up multiple brigades ahead of its 2023 offensive, and we see they were wiped out. They were eliminated. The remaining brigades that are still fighting on, they're fighting on into oblivion right now, being used as reserves, trying to fill in all the many and growing gaps along the line of contact. So that was an unsuccessful effort at standing up brigades in far too short of a period of time. I talked about how even under ideal conditions, it could take 1 to 2 years to stand up a brigade. And that's if you have the trained manpower to just assemble into a brigade and then train as a brigade. The problem Ukraine has is they don't even have that type of manpower on hand. A brigade is more than just 4,500 conscripts given basic training and weapons and then sent into battle. A brigade is an organization with a hierarchy, with units within units that make up the entire brigade. And you need to have entry-level soldiers at every level, each unit, but you also need to have specialists and leadership positions leading each one of those units, and then of course the entire brigade itself. And that type of experience, that type of leadership training and experience takes years to acquire, and Ukraine is out of that type of experienced manpower. Long ago, they ran out of that type of manpower. They're not putting brigades back together again. They're not building new brigades, especially not in a couple of months, 6 months, or a year's time. That will never happen. If people remember, NATO actually stood up multiple brigades between 2014 and 2022 before the special military operation began. All of those brigades, even according to Western analysts, have been completely eliminated. All that manpower is gone. The brigade exists because there was turnover, and everyone in that brigade is a replacement of those original troops trained by NATO over the course of those 8 years. So if that is what 8 years of effort produced, what can France produce in, say, 6 months to a year or even 2 years? Nothing. The answer is nothing. Nothing of any substance. And we're talking about a conflict where even Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had previously admitted Ukraine was losing 300 troops a day during the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So they are certainly losing many more than that per day. But let's just go with 300 a day. That means they're losing 2 brigades worth of men every single month. So what is France building? One poorly trained, almost certainly poorly equipped brigade over the course of several months. How is that going to change the calculus on the battlefield in Ukraine? It's not going to. And since we're talking about NATO training, France being a NATO member, let's look at some of the deep problems with NATO training. Let's ask ourselves what experience France has fighting in a conflict featuring the type of warfare unfolding in Ukraine right now. The answer is they have none. They have no experience fighting that type of conflict. So how are they going to train Ukrainians to be prepared for that type of fighting? They can't. And let's look at this somewhat older Business Insider article from May 2024. Western fighters in Ukraine are getting killed because they assumed the war would be easy, says a US veteran who fought there. And actually this article interviews multiple Western veterans. This is what the article says. Some Western fighters who joined the war in Ukraine have been killed because they assumed the fight would be easy, a US veteran who fought in Ukraine told Business Insider. The veteran, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, said a lot of foreign veterans who came to Ukraine to fight against Russia's invasion had been used to fighting at an advantage and struggled to adapt to the conditions there, where they are often outmanned and outgunned. Some members of the military and experts have said that NATO-style training given to Ukrainian soldiers has not served them well in this war because it is inappropriate training. It is training for soldiers fighting NATO style of warfare, which includes massive amounts of artillery, air power, high-tech weapons, and almost always as a condition, fighting a mismatch against a failed state, a poorly equipped, poorly trained army. NATO soldiers are not trained, and American soldiers are not trained to fight the Russian military or, say, the Chinese military or any military that is actually capable of fighting back sufficiently. So if this is the problem NATO training has, again, we go back to Macron, President Macron training one single brigade of Ukrainians and sending them back to Ukraine. What difference is that going to make? And one final article to round all of this up. Germany procures more artillery shells for Ukraine. This was June 6, 2024 from the Kiev Independent, a pro-Ukrainian source. And I'm not one to nitpick on grammar, especially of a newspaper whose staff most likely are not native English speakers, but procure means to acquire. You've acquired these shells, you have them. And I'm not nitpicking the grammar in the headline necessarily just because the Kiev Independent posted this, but because native English speakers were reposting this article as evidence that Ukraine is getting the artillery shells they need to fight this conflict against Russia. However, if you actually read the article, this is what it says. Germany has procured thousands of 155mm artillery shells for Ukraine and to replenish its own stocks, the country's defense ministry announced on June 6. An agreement has now been reached with a German arms company to produce and deliver thousands of projectiles to further support Ukraine and replenish its own ammunition stocks, it said in a statement. So a contract has been made, not a single physical artillery shell has been produced and transferred to Germany or to Ukraine. That is what is actually happening here. That is what the announcement is about. What else does this article reveal? It also says, by placing the order, the German defense minister also wants to ensure that Rheinmetall can launch a new production line in the central part of the country, Reuters said. So potentially some of these shells are to be produced in a production line that is yet to even be constructed. And so what we're actually talking about is, in the distant future, this is irrelevant to what is going on in Ukraine right now. The article mentioned some speculative quantities because the German announcement never mentioned any specific quantities, and the quantities mentioned only add up to about 300,000 artillery shells, which is less than 2 months worth of artillery fire for Ukraine if their daily rate of fire is 6,000 rounds, which is less than what Russia is firing, by the way. So that is the reality behind this seemingly optimistic headline that was passed off by Western commentators and analysts as a positive development for Ukraine. So what are all of these announcements from the US, from France, from Germany, what do all of these announcements actually add up to? Are these serious efforts? Are these serious developments that stand a chance to change the tide of the fighting on the battlefield in Ukraine? The answer is no. What this all actually adds up to is an attempt to create rhetorical and political momentum to gain control back over the narrative. Because as you can see, even in the West, amongst Western headlines, pessimism has been growing, panic and desperation spreading in the capitals across the West, Washington, London, Brussels. What they're trying to do is maybe psychologically overwhelm Russian leadership, the Russian public maybe, or at the very least bolster the morale of Ukrainians and international audiences who still support Ukraine. And when you make statements like this while also escalating in many other ways, and again, I highly suggest people follow Alex Christoforou, Alexander Mikuris of the Duran, Mark Sloboda, and Scott of Calibrated. Follow them. They do almost daily or almost daily updates on Ukraine specifically, and they are talking about all of the ways the West is escalating. You escalate when you escalate from a weak hand, when your only other alternative is direct warfare with Russia and an eventual nuclear exchange. That is extremely dangerous, but that's what desperation breeds. It breeds danger. So that is where we are in Ukraine right now, and a similar gap between Western rhetoric and actual reality continues to grow in the Middle East and also Asia Pacific. And the US will not be the first empire to blunder its way into the dustbin of history, because its hubris prevented itself from readjusting and reforming its foreign policy. We'll have to continue keeping an eye on all of this. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. If you thought this video in particular was useful, please like and share. In the video description below, there are links to other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest you follow me on Telegram if you're not already. I post absolutely everything there. People tell me they don't want to watch my videos on YouTube, and I fully understand why. I post all of my videos on Telegram. I've been having problems posting them on Odyssey and Rumble recently. I will try to get that resolved, but they will always be posted in full on Telegram. Articles that are censored on even X, I post those on Telegram. You can find them all there. Also in the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms, not YouTube or any other platform that I'm on. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no additional resources and you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there, all of that vastly helps. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.